Sounds like a plan.
All right.
The first thing I want to mention is that the story today will be mainly focused on Lars and Guri Anderson and their experience in Willmar, Minnesota in 1862. The reason that's important is because Willmar is a central location for a lot of the places that many of our family members settled before they moved up to cities like McLeod and Pekin and Grafton and that sort of thing. First, a bit of geography for you. Imagine Norway, that elongated country that goes from the Bering Sea up to the Arctic Circle. Imagine a spine up the middle of the country that is one long valley called the Gulbrandsdalen. That means Gulbrands Valley. Now, at the northern end of the Gulbrands Valley is a region called Lesja, L-E-S-J-A, and it's just a short distance from the old city of Trondheim, which was the first capital, I believe, of Norway. Anyway, Grandma's ancestors came from that area, all called Lesja. My ancestors came from an area called Hardanger. Now, here we have to start again. On the western coast of Norway, there's a city halfway up, maybe not quite halfway up, called Bergen. Bergen was an important port in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, and even later. It was one of what was called the, I can't remember the name of it, the Hanseatic League. The Hanseatic League started in Germany, but it wasn't a separate country. It wasn't a separate sort of organization. It was kind of like a corporation that had focus in a lot of different places. They had offices in probably 20 or 30 cities along the coasts of Europe, all the way down to Spain, many of them in Germany, around the Central Sea there. And then their northernmost port was Bergen in Norway. If you start at Bergen and then take a fjord that goes straight into the country, east and west, that fjord is called the Hardanger Fjord. Now, a fjord is a very, very deep body of water with small shoulders on either side that are flanked by huge mountains. Anyway, the Hardanger Fjord is many, many miles long. It's not very wide, but it's many miles long and goes right across the middle of the country.
Hello? What? Yeah, I am.
My ancestors came from the Hardanger Fjord area, and so they were called Hardanger people. Around the 1840s and 50s, the population had increased greatly in Norway. There was a population explosion around that time, and land was getting scarce. People had to move their farms farther up the mountain slopes, and it was very, very difficult to eke out a living there. I'll add a parenthesis here. In about 1900, or so, 1910, I think, one of my uh, great aunts, her name was Martha Flatabo, went back to Norway with her husband to see where her father had, what villages in that area her father had left. She walked, she had to go miles and miles into a side stream, then hike up to the mountainside, and finally get to where her father and mother and the early part of their family had left. She came back to America and she said to everyone, "I am so glad Papa had the good sense to leave that God-forsaken place." Yes, she was not very thrilled with what they had left. Anyway, that's part one of the story. The ancestors, many of the ancestors came, and they came in groups, but they came all together. So many of the people around Wilmer, Minnesota, and up to North Dakota were from the Hardanger Fjord area. Now, fast forward. In 1862, we were right in the middle of the Civil War. By that time, Lars and Guri Andresen had left Norway, had come to Wilmer, Minnesota, and set up a farm, and had some cattle, and were trying to grow crops, and were used to settling into an area. Now, formerly, this part of central Minnesota had been run over by the Indians. The Indians were organized in small tribal groups, and the way they would operate the land was in the spring they'd find some location where they could plant a few vegetables and crops and so forth, fruits, and then they'd stay there for the summer and harvest their fruits. And then in the fall, they'd depart from that area and leave it alone and go and live with a larger group of community of Indians in a joint tribal setting. The Indians regarded that territory as their roving territory. By 1862, however, a good many of the Indians had been forced to live on specific settlements. The government came in with Indian agents, supplying them with food occasionally, or sometimes cash, and hoped to get them contained. They also hoped to train them to become farmers, like Americans and Europeans were that settled there. Anyway, in 1862, a group of Indian boys, I shouldn't say boys, young men, organized themselves and decided to rid the area that comprised the Minnesota River Valley. They decided to go up and down that river valley and kill the settlers that had taken up residence there. Lars and Guri, I said, were living in one area, and they had come over with their 6 children. Now, the 6 children consisted of Andres,
Gertrude.
I can't remember their names. Anyway, there were 2 boys, two girls, and the Mrs. Andresen and a baby, and as well as Lars. They had that's five people. A sixth was um, Gertrude, who was married already to Osborne Erickson, and they had a farm about 2 miles from where Hans and Larsen Guri had a farm. Um, the Indians came and they first demanded Lars's cattle. He didn't want to give them to them, so they killed him. Then they killed the oldest boy, Andres, and they shot the youngest boy, who was, I think, about 10 or 12 years old, shot him. They had two girls, ages between 12 and 15. They grabbed the two girls and took off with them. Guri had escaped to what they called
Root cellar.
Root cellar. There was a hole in the ground that they dug to leave vegetables and so forth, so that they would and they could store those for most of the winter in that. And she took her baby and hid in the root cellar. The Indians didn't see her, so she wasn't harmed. But after things quieted down, she went out and discovered her husband had been killed, her oldest son had been killed, and her youngest son was badly wounded. But he was able to walk, and so she carried the baby and led the youngest son, and they walked to what she assumed to be her daughter's farm, a couple of miles away. The person who lived there was Osborne Erickson, and it turns out that his wife, Gertrude, had taken her two sons to the nearby fort when they heard that the Indians were coming. Now, some relationships here. Lars Anderson is my great-great-grandfather. Osborne and Gertrude Erickson are my great-grandparents. Now, you get those names from, you know that they are grandparents. Anne and I are your grandparents. And then our parents are your great-grandparents. So that's the relationship that we had. Anyway, Guri went as far as Osborne and Erickson's home, and she quietly went up to the house, and she heard some heard them speaking Norwegian. So she called them, and they said for her to come in. And she found Osborne Erickson badly wounded from the Indians shot through the walls of the house. Found him badly wounded. There was another farmer there named Solomon Foote, and he too was badly wounded. So poor Guri then had to devise some way to get help for them. She found a raft kind of thing that she managed to hook up to an oxen. The Indians had taken the cattle, but they didn't take the oxen because they moved too slowly for them. They wanted to move faster. So they left the oxen, and he stuck the oxen to the sleigh, loaded Osborne Erickson on it, Solomon Foote, and her own son, and took off then for the fort some miles away. She eventually got there and, of course, was then saved. Now, what happened to the two girls? The Indians had taken them, but that night they stopped to camp, and the girls escaped and went into the rushes beside the lake and hid in the rushes. The Indians couldn't find them and were anxious to go off and kill more settlers, so they left the girls there. And the girls eventually came out and were discovered by another settler who was traveling nearby, and he picked them up and took them to the fort, where they were reunited with their mother and their mother and their sister and two sisters. Osborne or Oscar, that was his name was Osborne, but they called him eventually Oscar to simplify it. Oscar and his wife Gertrude Erickson lived in a farm in the Wilmer area for many, many years. Now, I have, let's get it, the cane that I've got.
Oh, yeah. What if I put up his picture first?
I have a cane here that was given to Osborne and Gertrude Erickson on the occasion of their 50th wedding anniversary. And the cane is a gold-headed cane, and I'll show it to you here. Here it is. Can you see it?
Yes.
Can you see it?
I don't have access to my screen at the moment, but I'll look in a minute.
Well, it's a beautiful cane, and the top of it says from A.K. Tweedo, which is one of the persons on this picture that you.
He's on the far left with the mustache and the white hair.
He was Oscar Erickson's son-in-law. He was married to one of Oscar Erickson's daughters. And he says, from A.K. Tweedo to Oscar and Gertrude Erickson on the occasion of their 50th wedding anniversary.
If you're sharing a picture, I cannot see a picture. I can just see the cane.
Let's see. Oh, shoot. So this whole time you haven't been able to see Gertie either.
That is correct.
We'll put those pictures in later.
Okay.
Can't you do it?
Let's see.
Anyway, Oscar and Gertrude died just a few years after that 50th wedding anniversary celebration, but that was my great grandparents. Now the other
Okay, this is Gertie Andresen. And then this is the other picture.
Okay, this picture is Osborne, Oscar, and Gertrude celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary, and this is I think they had 8 or 9 children. One of whom, right?
Nope, over that way. Yep, nope, back. Right there.
This one that I'm putting the arrow to is my grandfather. His name was Erickson. And he was born in 1860 and died in 1935.
Could you run that first name by me again?
Elick. E-L-I-C-K.
Okay, and that's their family. Now, their family of 9 or 11 children, whatever it was a fairly common family size. That wasn't all the children they had, because they'd lost at least 3 or 4 in childbirth. So the families were rather large in that whole area at that time. Anyway, there's Alec. Now we'll move on to Alec and his wife. He married Ingeborg Flattable, and now Kaylee will bring up the Flattable family. Alec and Ingeborg had 9 children that lived to adulthood. They had 3 or 4 that died in childbirth. But is that the Flattable family?
Uh-huh.
And that's
Okay, can I point to them?
yeah, this is the Flattable family.
So Ole and Agape are the parents. Ingeborg is the one who married Alec.
She married Alec at about age 22. And so she's my grandmother. And I knew her. She died in 1940 when I was 10 years old. I remember my grandfather's death too. I was 5 years old then. I'm amazed my memory goes back that far. Good gosh. Anyway, I knew many of the rest of those persons on that picture. The great aunts and great uncles of my family. Anyway, Oscar and Ingeborg had 9 children too, 9 children that lived to adulthood. Oscar and Oscar married Ida Hilberg, and that's my mother. And but he was rather late in marrying her, because I think he was 40 or 28 years old, 38 years old when he married her. When he married my mother. There he is. He was in the army in World War One. That's him in uniform. Do you have another picture of Alec?
Alec.
Yeah, what is his army uniform picture? Do we have that?
Oh, of Oscar, we don't have that one. We do have this one.
Well, that isn't a very good picture, but anyway, that's my father.
Mm-hmm.
He was in World War One, and he was captured by the Germans in 1919. Unfortunately, it was just 3 days before the armistice, so he was only captured for 3 days. Kirsten's brought up another picture of my father when he was about 12 years old, and next to him are his twin brothers, Elvin and Abel. Elvin also married rather late, but has 6 children, most of whom are still alive. Anyway, we'll be seeing those children in McLeod when I go for Anne's middle service. That's my mother and father. Me, taken I think in 1942, when I was 12 years old. Now, that's as much of the story as I want to tell today. Eventually, I'd like to switch gears and tell you about growing up on the farm. But that's a very different sequence of pictures and a different storyline. So, I could mention this. Anne's ancestors came from Lesha, I said, and they settled primarily in Pekin and Devils Lake area of North Dakota. Whole communities, people from Russia were up there, and five Anne's grandfather's brothers. There were five of them that came in mass and settled there. We'll go into that story a bit later too. The other story that I'll add is my grandmother's from Sweden's history, where she came over in a love match with her future husband, but that's a story in itself.
This is Gertrude Andresen Erickson's obituary.
You want to read it?
Yeah, I was going to. This is the obituary of Gertrude Andresen Erickson, Oscar Asbjorn's wife, Grandpa's great-grandmother. Mrs. Oscar Erickson, the ranks of the old pioneers of the county are thinning fast. Among those who have passed away during the last week is Mrs. Oscar Erickson, whose maiden name was Gertrude Andresen, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Lars Andresen. The father was one of the victims of the Indian outbreak, and the mother was a heroine who saved the lives of Solomon Foote and Oscar Erickson by her heroic conduct in those perilous days. Mrs. Erickson was born in Hardanger, Norway, May 6, 1840, and died October 22nd, 1918. She had been ailing for the last 5 years, but confined to her bed for 6 weeks when she suffered a stroke of paralysis, which was the immediate cause of her death. Mrs. Erickson's childhood days were spent in Norway. At the age of 12 years, and according to Uncle Jeff, 16, she came with her parents to America. They settled on a claim on the north shore of Solomon Lake in 1857. She was married to Oscar Erickson in March 1859. Part of their married life was spent in Meeker County. After the death of her mother, they moved to the old homestead where they lived till Mr. Erickson's death 8 years ago, when she moved to Wilmer to live with her daughter, Mrs. C.W. Olson, where she died. Mrs. Erickson was the mother of 10 children, 5 sons and 5 daughters, all of whom are living. The sons are Alec Erickson of Milner, North Dakota, his grandfather.
My grandfather.
And he was alive. He was about 2 years old during the Indian uprising. Alec was. Ole of Richland, North Dakota, Lars of Wilmer, Almond of Abercrombie, North Dakota, Andrew of McLeod, North Dakota. The daughters are Mrs. A.K. Tweedo of Abercrombie, North Dakota, Mrs. H.A. Hart and Mrs. E.J. Berg of Bellingham, Washington, Mrs. C.W. Olson of Wilmer, and Mrs. C.T. McDonald of Minneapolis. All the children were present at the funeral except Mrs. Berg and Mrs. Hart, the two from Bellingham, Washington. The deceased had one sister living, Mrs. P.P. Alvig of the town of Dover. There are 35 grandchildren and 8 great-grandchildren. On account of the prevailing epidemic, and this was during the Spanish flu of 1918, the funeral was a private one held last Friday afternoon, October 25th at Solomon Lake Cemetery. Reverend J.N. Anderson of Wilmer officiated. The floral offerings were many and beautiful. The pallbearers were 5 sons of the deceased and her grandchild, Almond McDonald of Minneapolis.
Now, when we go to McLeod, where we'll have your grandmother's commitment ceremony, they'll go to McLeod, and then some of the family are planning trips up to Grafton to see where Grandma grew up, and others are, well, you'll see McLeod where I grew up, and then others are going to go down to Wilmer to see the graves of Guri Anderson and Osborne and Gertrude Erickson, because they're down in that area too.
The house that they lived in on Solomon Lake during the Indian Uprising is also still there. It is a monument. And it was primarily saved because when Oscar and Gertrude lived there, they sided it. And so they basically sided the cabin that Guri and Lars had lived in. And so that preserved the cabin underneath. And so when they took the siding down, they found the cabin, and that's still there.
So there'll be lots
That's
of
really
history
cool.
that you can, and lots of history that you can experience when you go back there. Okay, there'll be more to the story as we introduce other family members, but that's enough for this one.
All right.